Voiceover begins. Have you ever witnessed a moment that changed everything? Two little girls abandoned with a suitcase in an airport until a billionaire stopped and asked one question that changed everything. Ryan Gray had walked through countless airports in his career, never once imagining that a single glance could stop him cold. That morning, as he strode through the main terminal with his assistant trailing behind him, carrying files and itinerary printouts, he was thinking only about the meeting ahead, how many millions it might bring in, how quickly he could return to the safety of his corner office, where nothing and no one could surprise him. He wore his favorite blue suit, perfectly pressed, the expensive watch on his wrist catching the fluorescent light overhead. Even in a crowd, he always carried the same aura. Someone too focused to be interrupted. But wait, what if that focus shifted to something unimaginable? As he turned toward the private security lane, a flicker of movement caught his eye, something that didn't belong in the orderly stream of travelers and their purposeful strides. Two little girls stood alone near the end of the check-in counters, so still they almost seemed part of the scenery. It took him a moment to register what he was seeing. They were small, maybe 5 years old, and clearly twins. Identical brown hair and tidy braids, identical wide blue eyes that scanned the hall with the blank, stunned look of children who hadn't yet decided whether to be afraid or to hope someone would come back for them. Each wore a yellow and white dress that looked too light for the chilly air conditioning, and together they clung to the handle of a single gray suitcase that was nearly as big as they were. For a second, Ryan tried to look away. It wasn't his place. He wasn't the kind of man who stopped to ask strangers if they were all right. But he couldn't ignore the way one of the girls shifted her weight, glancing at the departure boards and then back at the entrance doors as though she half expected her world to reappear. He told himself he would take just a moment. Just long enough to be sure someone was coming for them. As he approached, he felt the old unfamiliar sensation of his heartbeat speeding up, the cold of the tile floor seeping through the soles of his shoes. He stopped a few feet away and cleared his throat, lowering his voice so it wouldn't sound too sharp. "Are you two waiting for someone?" he asked carefully, not wanting to startle them. The twins looked up in perfect unison, and the look in their eyes, open, vulnerable, exhausted, hit him harder than he was ready for. The one on the left, he would learn her name was Maddie, blinked slowly as though she was trying to decide if he was real or just another adult who would keep walking. The other, her voice so thin it nearly vanished in the vast hall, whispered, "Our daddy flew away without us." It wasn't the words themselves that made his stomach lurch, but the simple, quiet certainty in her tone. Like she knew this was just how life worked. Ryan felt something constrict behind his ribs, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. He glanced around, half expecting to see a frantic parent running toward them. But there was no one, just travelers hurrying past, never noticing the two little girls who had been left behind. He knelt down so he could look them in the eyes without towering over them, his suit creasing as he rested one hand lightly on the suitcase between them. "Where's your mom?" he asked, and for a moment he wished he could swallow the question back, because he already knew from the way their eyes went glassy. Maddie lifted her chin and said in a voice so heartbreakingly steady, "She died." Ryan didn't have any words left. He only sat there, frozen, as the reality settled around them like something solid and heavy. Two little girls alone in an airport, abandoned by the only parent they had left. He felt his throat tighten, and before he could think about how it must look, this man in a flawless suit kneeling on the floor with tears threatening his composure, he reached out and rested his hand over theirs where they clutched the handle of the suitcase. Could this be the start of an extraordinary journey? He didn't know why, but it felt important that they know he wasn't going to walk away. Not this time. Ryan didn't know how long he stayed kneeling there in front of the girls, feeling the strange mixture of helplessness and determination that had begun to take root in his chest. He could feel the occasional curious glance from passers-by, but no one slowed down. No one asked if the children needed help. It was as though the rest of the world had agreed to pretend they weren't there. Two small figures clutching each other and their single suitcase as if it were the last anchor they had. He drew in a slow, steadying breath, and told himself he had to be the one to do something. He couldn't simply stand up, straighten his cuffs, and keep walking back into the safe, predictable world he'd built around himself. He glanced up and saw an airline attendant watching them from behind her counter, her expression wary, but sympathetic. He raised a hand in a silent gesture for her to wait. Then he turned back to the girls. "My name is Ryan," he said, making his voice as calm as he could manage. "I know you don't know me, but I promise I want to help you. Can you tell me your names?" The girl who had spoken first drew in a breath that sounded shaky but brave. "I'm Maddie," she said softly, her hand tightening on the suitcase handle. "This is Lily." She looked at her sister, who nodded as though confirming that yes, this was all the information a stranger needed to have. But Ryan knew it wasn't nearly enough. He looked down at the luggage tag he'd noticed before. The handwriting on it was rushed. The markers smudged. Madison and Lillian Carter. No contact number. No forwarding address. Just their names. As if that was all their father had thought to leave behind. He felt something go cold inside him. He had heard of parents walking away. But standing here face to face with the reality of it, the cruelty of it, made his hands shake. He rested them flat on his knees so the girls wouldn't see. "Maddie, Lily," he said carefully. "Do you know where your daddy went?" Maddie swallowed and lifted her chin in that small, determined way she would come to do whenever she was trying not to cry. "He said he was going somewhere far, somewhere we couldn't go." Her lower lip trembled and Ryan felt something in his own heart splinter. He reached out without thinking and gently placed his hand over hers. She looked down at their joined hands with an expression so solemn it made his throat tighten again. "I'm so sorry," he said, because there was nothing else honest he could think to say. "You didn't deserve that. None of this is your fault." Lily shifted closer to her sister and pressed her cheek against Maddie's arm. And Ryan realized that they were both shivering now. Whether from fear or from the cold air, he couldn't be sure. He straightened slowly and glanced around the terminal, feeling the practical part of his mind kick back in. He had no plan, no right to intervene. But he knew he couldn't leave them. He took out his phone and called the only person he trusted to handle something this delicate, his lawyer Margaret, who had been with him through every corporate disaster and personal misstep. While the phone rang, he crouched again, lowering his voice. "I'm going to call someone who can help us figure out what to do. You don't have to be afraid. I promise I won't go anywhere." Maddie studied him, her blue eyes bright with confusion and something like weary hope. She nodded once as if to say she was willing to believe him, at least for now. When Margaret finally picked up, he stepped a few feet away, but kept the girls in his sight. He explained quickly, trying to keep his voice steady as he described what he'd found. He heard the shock in her silence and then the professionalism in her questions. Were there any tags, any documentation, any sign that this was a misunderstanding? He answered everything as best he could, feeling his own disbelief with every word. When he ended the call, Margaret promised she'd contact Child Protective Services immediately and send someone to the airport. But even as he hung up, he knew he wasn't going to hand them over to strangers and walk away. He turned back to see Maddie and Lily watching him with identical expressions, so small and exhausted, but somehow still expectant, as if some part of them hadn't yet let go of the idea that someone might be coming back for them. He walked over slowly and sank down to one knee again. "Help is coming," he said quietly. "But until then, I'm going to stay right here with you." He paused, searching their faces for any flicker of fear. "Would that be okay?" Maddie nodded. Lily didn't say anything, but she reached out and rested her tiny hand against his wrist. The warmth of that simple touch nearly undid him. And as he sat there in the middle of the bustling terminal, he realized that for the first time in years, he didn't care if he missed his flight. Some things were simply more important. Ryan wasn't sure how long they sat together on the cold tile floor of the terminal while the morning traffic of travelers flowed around them in steady waves. He kept expecting that someone official would arrive quickly. A security officer, a social worker, someone whose job it was to know exactly how to handle this. But the minutes dragged on and no one came. His phone vibrated twice with calls from his assistant and once from a board member who must have already noticed he had missed his flight. He didn't answer any of them. He kept the girls within arm's reach, feeling that if he looked away even for a moment, they might vanish or worse, slip back into the shadows where no one would ever see them. The thought made his chest tighten until it was hard to draw a steady breath. He watched Maddie and Lily as they sat pressed together, so close it was as though they believed they could only stay safe if their shoulders touched. Every few minutes, Lily would rest her cheek against Maddie's arm and close her eyes, but she never fully relaxed. Maddie kept glancing up at him, her small face serious and searching. It occurred to him that she was trying to decide whether he was trustworthy, whether he was just another adult who would promise something he couldn't keep. He wished he had some paper or a toy, something to distract them from the vast emptiness of the terminal and the fact that everyone who passed by pretended not to see them. But all he had to give was his presence, and he hoped absurdly that it was enough. At last, when he felt almost ready to stand up and start demanding answers from anyone in a uniform, his phone lit up with Margaret's name. He answered so quickly he nearly fumbled it. She explained in her precise, calm voice that she had contacted Child Protective Services and that an emergency social worker had been dispatched. It could still be another hour before they arrived. She said she could arrange for him to leave them in the care of airport security, but even as she spoke, Ryan knew he wouldn't do that. He thanked her quietly, ignoring the strain in her voice when she reminded him he was under no legal obligation to stay. When the call ended, he looked at the twins and felt something final settle inside him. Obligation had nothing to do with this. It was a choice he'd already made. He shifted closer so they wouldn't have to strain to hear him. "Someone is coming to help," he said gently. "They'll make sure you have somewhere safe to sleep tonight." Lily's lower lip wobbled, but she didn't cry. Maddie looked straight at him and asked in a whisper, "Will you come, too?" Her voice cracked on the last word, as if she'd been holding it in until she couldn't anymore. Ryan swallowed against the sudden ache in his throat. He thought of all the meetings and deals he had once believed were the measure of his life. None of them had ever made him feel this certain. "If they'll let me," he said honestly, "I'll be there." The relief on her face was so immediate and so unguarded that he had to look away for a moment to keep from losing his composure. They waited in that little pocket of quiet, the hum of announcements and rolling suitcases blending into a steady backdrop. Eventually, an airport worker approached with a paper cup of apple juice and 2 small packets of crackers. She knelt and offered them with a kind smile, and Maddie took them carefully, her fingers trembling just a little. Ryan murmured his thanks, and when the woman walked away, he noticed her eyes were wet. For the first time, he realized how many people had been watching from a distance. People who were moved but didn't know how to step in. Maddie tore open the cracker packet with determined little motions and handed half to Lily before nibbling the corner of her own piece. He felt such fierce admiration for her composure that it almost hurt. He couldn't help but think of Lily, his Lily, and how often she had needed reassurance when she was this small. He remembered holding her hand when she was sick, how her whole body seemed to relax when she knew he wasn't going anywhere. He wondered if these girls had ever known what that felt like. That absolute certainty that someone would always come back for them. His throat was tight when he finally spoke again. "I'm glad you told me your names," he said, his voice low and rough. "That was very brave." Maddie looked up and for the first time there was something almost like hope in her expression. "Are you going to stay until they come?" she asked. He nodded without hesitation. "Yes, I promise." Lily shifted her weight until she was leaning against his arm and Maddie rested her head on his shoulder, the tiniest sigh escaping her. It felt as though they had decided for this one moment that he was safe. And even though he knew there were no guarantees, that everything could still change, he realized he would do whatever it took to prove they were right. Ryan didn't think he would ever forget the feeling of those 2 small heads resting against him in the middle of the airport. For a man who had built his entire adult life around the idea that vulnerability was a weakness to be hidden behind polished suits and airtight contracts, it was almost disorienting to realize how natural it felt to sit there on the floor and simply be a steady presence for children he had known less than an hour. Every so often, Lily would shift, her cheek brushing against his sleeve, and Maddie would tighten her grip on the suitcase handle as though she needed to remind herself it hadn't disappeared. He found that he didn't mind any of it. If anything, the quiet weight of their trust anchored him in a way he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't until he heard the soft, clipped steps approaching that he lifted his head and saw the social worker walking toward them. She was a woman in her 40s with a calm face and a blue lanyard around her neck, holding out a badge so there could be no confusion about who she was. Ryan felt Maddie and Lily stiffen beside him, the instinctive recoil of children who had already learned that official voices often meant more loss. He laid a hand gently on Maddie's back and tried to reassure her with a look, though he didn't know if it worked. The woman knelt a respectful distance away, her eyes kind but professional as she introduced herself. Her name was Diane, and she said it in a tone that suggested she'd practiced making it sound warm, even though her job often meant delivering children into uncertainty. Diane didn't try to touch them or coax them to stand. Instead, she spoke softly and explained that she was there to help them figure out what would happen next. She asked if they wanted to tell her anything about where they had come from. Maddie swallowed hard, her chin trembling as she tried to find the words. Ryan felt her look at him before she answered, and he gave her the smallest nod, silently telling her it was all right. She took a shaky breath and said their father had told them he couldn't take care of them anymore. The quiet in that moment was so deep it felt almost physical, like the air itself was absorbing the impact of what she'd confessed. Diane's eyes grew even gentler as she wrote a few notes on her clipboard. Though she never stopped watching the girls' faces as if to make sure they didn't feel invisible. When Diane finished, she looked up at Ryan, studying him carefully in the way of someone who had seen too many well-meaning bystanders fade away when things became complicated. "Mr. Gray," she asked, not unkindly, but with the quiet authority of someone who needed the answer on record. Ryan introduced himself, his voice steadier than he expected, and briefly explained how he had found the girls alone. He saw something flicker in Diane's eyes when he mentioned his position, the way she registered his name, as if she'd already heard of him in some distant headline. But to her credit, she didn't let it change her tone. "Thank you for staying," she said simply, and there was no sarcasm in it, just genuine acknowledgement. Maddie turned then, her small voice trembling. "Will he come back?" she asked, not specifying whether she meant her father or Ryan himself. He realized she probably didn't know which question mattered more. He looked directly into her wide blue eyes, feeling the truth settle into place. "I don't know about your daddy," he said honestly. "But I'm not going anywhere." Diane studied him again, her expression more thoughtful now, and he knew she was assessing whether he meant it or was simply saying what any adult would say in the moment. He didn't flinch under her scrutiny because he knew he wasn't lying. Diane explained gently that the girls would have to come with her for now. She promised it would only be for a little while, that there were nice people who would look after them while the court decided what happened next. Maddie's shoulders hunched as if she were bracing for something cold and inevitable. Lily didn't make a sound, only pressed herself more firmly into Ryan's side. He closed his hand around hers and held it as steadily as he could. "Can he come?" Maddie asked again, her voice breaking. Diane hesitated. "That depends," she said carefully, "on whether Mr. Gray wants to be involved in this longer term." She said it as a question, but the way she looked at him made it clear she already suspected the answer. Ryan didn't look away. He understood exactly what it would mean. Lawyers, paperwork, scrutiny of every corner of his life. But when he glanced down at Lily's small hand, still gripping his sleeve and Maddie's tearful searching eyes, he knew he couldn't pretend he was going to walk away. "Not now. Not ever." "Yes," he said quietly, his voice certain. "I want to be there. However I'm allowed to be." Something in Diane's face softened. She nodded once and stood, inviting them to rise. Maddie and Lily looked to him, and he stood first so he could offer each of them a hand. They took it without hesitation. As they walked together across the terminal to the quiet room Diane had arranged, Ryan realized that the moment he had knelt in front of them had been the end of one life and the start of another. And for the first time in years, he felt no regret at all. The quiet room Diane led them to was tucked behind a set of frosted glass doors near the airport's administrative offices. It was small and plainly furnished, just a few padded chairs, a low table with a stack of children's books, and a water cooler humming softly in the corner, but it was warmer than the cavernous terminal. And the moment they stepped inside, Maddie and Lily seemed to breathe a little easier. Ryan held their hands as they walked across the carpet, feeling the slight tremor in their grips. He didn't let go even after they settled into the chairs, as though all three of them knew the thin thread of contact was the only thing that kept the uncertainty from swallowing them whole. Diane perched on a nearby chair with her clipboard resting on her knee. She explained in her measured, patient voice that she had called the emergency foster coordinator and that someone was on their way to meet them. Her tone was reassuring but careful, the practiced balance of empathy and detachment that came from doing this work long enough to know when to temper hope. Ryan listened, feeling the questions piling up inside him. How long would it take to get legal standing? Whether he'd have to prove he wasn't some opportunist, what the girls would be told in the meantime. He didn't ask any of it yet. He could tell that Maddie and Lily were listening too, trying to understand words they were too young to fully grasp, and he didn't want them to hear the tension in his voice. Instead, he crouched in front of their chairs and looked them both in the eye. "You are safe now," he said, the certainty in his voice surprising even him. "Nothing bad is going to happen to you today. You have people who care about you." Maddie's chin wobbled, but she pressed her lips together, determined not to cry. Lily reached up and took hold of his wrist, her small fingers curling around his watch band. She didn't say anything, but he could feel her trust in that touch, and it nearly undid him. He wished he could give them more than promises, more than borrowed authority from a system that had already failed them once. Diane began quietly asking questions about whether they had any other family, grandparents, aunts, uncles. Maddie shook her head with the tired resignation of someone who had already asked herself the same questions and come up empty. She explained in halting sentences that after their mom died, their father had moved them from state to state, never staying anywhere long. They had no friends, no teachers who might have noticed. Ryan felt an anger growing under his skin that he didn't try to disguise. He could hardly comprehend the kind of person who could leave two little girls in an airport with nothing but a suitcase and no plan. A knock at the door interrupted them and Diane rose to admit another woman, a young caseworker in a gray blazer carrying a tablet and a manila folder. She introduced herself as Claire and greeted the girls in a gentle voice that reminded Ryan of a kindergarten teacher. She knelt to their level and explained that she was going to take them somewhere they could sleep and eat a real dinner, that she would stay with them until everything was sorted out. Maddie stared at the carpet, her face pale, and Lily pressed her cheek into Ryan's hand. He felt the smallest tremor run through her shoulders. It was only when Claire rose and looked at him that he realized he was still kneeling, his hand steadying Lily's back. Claire spoke softly but firmly. "You're welcome to walk them out with us, but from here it's protocol to transfer them to foster care. If you want to pursue custody, you'll need to file a petition." Her gaze was sympathetic, but her voice was edged with finality. Ryan met her eyes and nodded, though inside he felt something settle like a stone in his chest. He wasn't their father, and the system didn't care what he felt or what they had shared in a few desperate hours. He understood that it would take more than intention to stay part of their story. He rose slowly and reached for the girl's hands. "I'll be right here until you have to go," he said, and he was relieved to hear that his voice didn't shake. Maddie leaned into him and for the first time she began to cry, silent tears sliding down her cheeks as she pressed her face against his side. He smoothed her hair, feeling her ribs hitch with every sob. Lily watched her sister and then wrapped her arms around them both, her tiny voice whispering something he couldn't quite hear. For a long time, he simply held them. He didn't care who came in or what they thought of the man in the expensive suit kneeling on the floor, trying to absorb a heartbreak that wasn't even his to begin with. When Diane finally touched his arm, her voice soft, he knew he couldn't delay it any longer. He eased back just enough to look Maddie in the eyes. "You will be okay," he told her, willing her to believe it. "And I'm going to do everything I can to see you again." She nodded with a tearful gulp. Lily didn't speak, but clung to his hand until Claire gently coaxed her free. He watched as they each took one of the girls' hands and led them to the door, their little suitcase rolling quietly behind them. When Maddie turned to look back, he lifted his hand in a promise that he would keep no matter what it took. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and in the sudden hush, Ryan felt the shape of a decision that had already formed in his heart. He was not going to let them disappear into the system. He was going to fight for them. Ryan remained in that quiet room long after the girls were led away, sitting in the same chair where Maddie's head had rested against his arm. He let the silence wash over him, trying to piece together the shape of what had just happened, as if replaying it in his mind might help him understand why it had so completely dismantled the careful barriers he'd spent a lifetime constructing. The moment the door closed, it was as though he had been returned to the old version of himself, the one who lived in a polished world of profits and contracts and never let any feeling slip through the cracks. But now he felt like that man had already been erased, replaced by someone he hadn't planned to become. Someone who could no longer pretend that none of this was his concern. When he finally stood, he moved slowly as though his body was reluctant to follow the demands of routine. He walked down the corridor and out into the terminal where the same flood of travelers still hurried past, oblivious. He wondered how many of them would have paused to notice two little girls alone with a suitcase. He wondered how many times he himself had looked away from things he couldn't fix because it was easier. The thought left him hollow and restless. As he reached the main doors, he called Margaret, his voice steady because he knew she would hear the urgency in it without him needing to explain. She didn't question why he had stayed so long. She didn't even sound surprised when he told her he wanted to start the paperwork to petition for custody. She only asked for the girls' names and the details he had, and he felt something almost like relief that at least one person in his life didn't require justification for this decision. When he hung up, he knew it was only the beginning. He knew he was about to invite scrutiny into every private part of his life, but he also knew that none of it mattered. He spent the next few days in a haze of meetings with lawyers and phone calls with caseworkers who spoke in clipped, polite voices that betrayed nothing of what they thought of his motives. He learned quickly how complicated the process would be, how many barriers existed between a stranger and the right to claim two children as family. Some days the bureaucratic language felt so cold he wanted to tear the files in half and demand that someone look him in the eye and acknowledge that this was more than paperwork. But every time he felt the frustration rising, he would remember the way Lily's hand had wrapped around his wrist, or the way Maddie had whispered her question, "Will you come too?" And the anger would drain into something steadier. Determination, he realized, was the only currency that mattered now. On the fourth day, he was granted permission for a supervised visit. He drove to the address they gave him, a nondescript beige house on a suburban street that looked exactly like every other in the row. His heart thumped so hard it felt unsteady as he parked and walked up the narrow path to the porch. The door opened before he could knock, and a woman with kind eyes and a tired smile ushered him in. She explained that the girls were in the living room and that it had been a difficult week for them. He thanked her without really hearing what he was saying because his mind was already fixed on the small figures sitting side by side on the couch, their hands clasped together so tightly their knuckles were white. They looked up as he stepped into the room. For a moment, no one spoke. He wondered if they would even recognize him out of context, in clothes that didn't smell like an airport without the backdrop of rolling suitcases and loudspeakers. But then Maddie's eyes widened and she scrambled to her feet before anyone could stop her, running across the carpet until she collided with his legs. He caught her instinctively, his hands settling on her narrow shoulders, and felt her bury her face against his chest. Lily came more slowly, but when she reached him, she pressed herself against his side, her cheek against his coat, and didn't move. He knelt carefully so he could hold them both, his arms around their small, tense bodies. No one said anything to interrupt, not even the caseworker who stood discreetly by the doorway. He didn't care that they were being watched or that every moment would be documented. All that mattered was the quiet, trembling relief in the way they clung to him, as if some part of them had truly believed he might never come back. After a while, Maddie looked up, her eyes red but clear. "Did you come to get us?" she asked, her voice raw from crying. He swallowed hard, wishing he could give her the answer she deserved. "Not yet," he said softly, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "But I'm working on it. I won't stop until I can." Lily didn't speak, but she nodded against his shoulder as though that promise was enough for now. The caseworker eventually stepped forward to explain that the visit would be limited to an hour. Ryan nodded without argument, even though he felt the unfairness of it burning through him. He spent the rest of the time sitting with them on the floor, coloring pictures in a battered sketchbook someone had left behind. Every so often, Maddie's small hand would drift over to rest on his knee, like she needed to check he was still real. When it was time to go, he kissed the top of each of their heads and told them again that he would come back. The promise felt bigger than anything he'd ever said before. As he walked back to his car, he didn't feel the same hollow grief that had followed him out of the airport. He felt a clear, quiet purpose that steadied his steps, and he knew that however long it took, he would be there until the end. The weeks that followed blurred into one long procession of paperwork, legal consultations, and supervised visits that never felt long enough. Every time Ryan arrived at the beige house with the narrow porch, he felt the same mix of anticipation and dread. He knew by then that the girls would be waiting in the living room, sitting side by side on the faded couch with their hands clenched together, the suitcase they had carried into the airport resting by their feet as though it had become their last symbol of continuity. Each time he crossed that threshold, their eyes would search his face for any sign of change, any flicker of news that today would be the day they could leave with him and never have to wonder again if he would come back. He wished he could give them that certainty. He wished he could pick them up, carry them to the car, and drive straight home without another signed form or another meeting where strangers evaluated whether his reasons were pure enough, stable enough, worthy enough. But nothing in this process was simple, and he knew that every hour he spent proving himself was another hour they spent learning that even good promises sometimes took too long to keep. During each visit, he learned the small, private details of their lives in this temporary place. He learned that Lily slept with the suitcase propped against her bed so she could touch it if she woke up at night. He learned that Maddie liked to sit at the kitchen table and draw pictures of houses with wide porches and flower boxes, the kind she'd never lived in. He learned that every time he had to leave, they would wait by the front window until his car disappeared around the corner. He began to measure the progress of their trust, not in words, but in the way they slowly let themselves relax in his presence. At first, they never took off their shoes, never put down the small bags they carried. But after a few visits, Maddie began to slip off her sneakers the moment he sat down, curling her legs up in his lap as if she had decided she didn't need to be ready to leave at any moment. Lily took longer. She still hesitated before touching him, still needed Maddie's silent encouragement to reach for his hand. But one afternoon, when he was reading to them from a storybook he'd brought, she leaned against his arm without being asked, her cheek warm through the sleeve of his sweater. It was such a small gesture, but it felt to him like a threshold had been crossed. When he wasn't with them, he worked tirelessly with Margaret to prepare everything the court required. There were home visits, interviews, background checks so exhaustive they dug up articles from the early days of his company, when he'd been young enough to believe nothing could touch him. He signed affidavits that declared his income and his medical records and his intentions in language so formal it made something in him bristle. No matter how many times Margaret assured him that this was normal, that this was how the system worked to protect children, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being asked to prove that love alone wasn't a liability. Some nights he lay awake in his quiet penthouse, replaying every moment he'd spent with Maddie and Lily, trying to find some flaw in himself that the court would seize on and decide he was unfit. He knew he had never been anyone's father before. But the certainty that he wanted to be theirs had taken root so deeply that he couldn't imagine returning to the man he had been before that morning in the airport. The hardest part was explaining to the girls why he couldn't take them home yet. Maddie always asked first, her voice tentative but hopeful, "Will it be today?" And every time he had to shake his head and say, "Not yet," he watched something flicker in her expression, the brief, careful recalibration of a child learning how to wait without giving up. Lily never asked, but her eyes were always on his face, searching for a truth she was too young to name. On the drive home after each visit, he would replay that look over and over, promising himself that he would never let it become disappointment. He knew it was a promise he couldn't control completely. But he made it anyway because he needed them to believe in something. One evening, when the caseworker brought the girls into the small visiting room, Maddie was carrying a piece of folded paper clutched so tightly in her fist that the edges were crumpled. She sat down beside him, her hand trembling as she pressed it into his palm. "I drew it for you," she whispered, not looking up. He unfolded the paper slowly and felt his throat tighten when he saw what she had drawn. It was a house bigger than any they had ever seen together, with flowers in the windows and 3 stick figures in front. 2 little girls both smiling, and between them a tall figure with dark hair holding both their hands. He looked down at her and saw she was watching him from under her lashes, waiting to see if he understood. He set the drawing carefully on the table, and when he pulled her into his arms, she didn't resist. Lily climbed into his lap without a word and rested her head on his shoulder. They sat like that until the visit ended, and when he finally had to stand, he folded the picture and tucked it inside his coat, as if carrying it there might keep it safe until he could make it real. Driving home through the quiet streets, he caught himself imagining the house from Maddie's drawing. How it would feel to unlock the door and walk inside with them. How it would feel to fill the rooms with voices and laughter. It was the first time in years he let himself envision a future that wasn't defined by loss. And in that moment, he knew without question that no court, no document, no doubt in the world could make him stop trying to bring them home. The day the court hearing finally arrived, Ryan woke before dawn with a calm that felt almost fragile, like something he didn't dare trust completely until he was standing in front of the judge and hearing the words out loud. He showered and dressed in a dark suit, the same one he had worn to every meeting and supervised visit, because some part of him believed it mattered to show that he was steady, dependable, the opposite of the man who had abandoned Maddie and Lily in an airport terminal without a backward glance. As he tied his tie, he thought about how many times he'd stood in front of investors or board members wearing the same uniform of success, how those meetings had always felt like life and death. Now he understood that none of them had ever really mattered. Not like this. When he arrived at the courthouse, Margaret was already waiting on the steps, her expression composed, but kind. She greeted him with a nod that said more than words, an acknowledgement of all the months they had spent preparing every affidavit, every reference, every financial disclosure. She didn't waste time on reassurances they both knew were empty. She simply said, "You've done everything you could. Today, it's in the judge's hands." He nodded because there was nothing else to do, and together they walked through the security checkpoint and down the polished hallways toward the courtroom where a decision would finally be made. The girls were already inside, sitting with their foster mother at a small table near the front. Lily was clutching her sister's hand so tightly that Maddie's knuckles were white. But when she saw Ryan, her face lit up in a way that made his chest ache. He wished he could go straight to them, wrap them in his arms, and tell them everything would be all right. But for now, he had to remain behind his own table. He took his seat and felt the old familiar pulse of adrenaline, the reflex to prepare for an argument. But this wasn't a negotiation. There was no counteroffer, no fallback position. He had only the truth of what he wanted and the certainty that he was willing to be the person those girls needed him to be. The judge, a woman with silver hair and a lined, serious face, entered without preamble. Her voice was low and measured as she called the hearing to order and began to read through the case summary. Ryan listened as she recited the facts he had memorized long ago, the date and place the girls were found, the attempts to contact their father, the complete absence of any relative willing to take them. She spoke about his petition to adopt them, about the references who had written in support of his character, about the assessments that declared his home suitable and his commitment genuine. Each phrase felt like a stone being set into place, building the foundation of something that would no longer be temporary. At one point, the judge paused and looked directly at Ryan. She asked why he had decided to intervene that day in the airport. What had made him stay when so many others would have walked by? The question startled him more than he expected. He swallowed and tried to find the words that would be simple enough to be understood and strong enough to be believed. "Because they looked at me," he said finally, his voice rough but steady. "And in that moment, I realized I couldn't leave them. I don't know how to explain it more than that. They needed someone to come back for them, and I knew I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I walked away." The judge studied him in silence, her expression unreadable, and then she nodded once and returned to her notes. The rest of the hearing passed in a blur of procedural language. The girl's foster mother was called to speak about their adjustment, about the way Maddie had begun to smile again and Lily had started to sleep through the night. The caseworker described the bond she had witnessed during visits, how the girls had stopped watching the door with that silent, exhausted hope once they understood he would always return. Margaret spoke last, her voice clear and composed, explaining that Ryan's commitment went beyond financial stability, that he had shown in every action that he was ready to be their parent in every sense. When it was time for the judge to give her decision, the room seemed to go utterly still. Ryan felt his heartbeat thud against his ribs as if it were counting down to something irreversible. He looked at Maddie and Lily, who were watching him with wide, anxious eyes, and he realized he had never wanted anything as much as he wanted this. The judge cleared her throat and began to read her ruling. She spoke about the law, about the requirements of permanency, and the standard of the child's best interests. And then in a voice that was suddenly gentler, she said she found that it was in Maddie and Lily Carter's best interest to be placed permanently with Ryan Gray as their adoptive parent. For a second, he couldn't process what he'd heard. The word seemed to hang in the air like something too good to touch. And then Maddie let out a sob, a sound of pure relief, and Lily turned in her chair and reached for him with both hands. He rose, unable to stay seated any longer, and crossed the space between them. They collided with him in a tangle of small arms and tearful faces, and he knelt there on the courtroom floor with both of them pressed against his chest, aware that the judge and the caseworker and every stranger in the gallery were watching. But for once, he didn't care about any of it. All that mattered was that when he told them they were going home, it would be true. Afterward, as they stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight, Maddie slipped her hand into his and looked up at him with a smile that still carried a trace of disbelief. "We get to stay," she whispered as if she needed to hear it one more time to be sure. He bent down so he could look her in the eye. "You get to stay," he said, his voice unshakable. "You're mine now, and I'm yours." Lily pressed her face against his side and let out a long, shuddering breath. He held them both close, feeling the weight of everything they had survived together and the bright, terrifying promise of everything still ahead. For the first time since that morning in the airport, he felt like they were all exactly where they were meant to be. Brought to you by Millionaire in Love.